And there are moments in this war when the entire republic is at stake, when everything could have changed, when everything could have turned on a dime, and sometimes did.
What is being forged is our national story. Our Iliad and our Odyssey is playing out.
At dawn, near a creek in northern Georgia called the Chickamauga, Union forces desperately prepare for an attack that is imminent. Confederate General Braxton Bragg imagines the second day of the Battle of Chickamauga to bring destruction to the Union Army. But once again, a breakdown in communication plagues the Confederates. The Southern assault will not begin until 9:30 a.m.
One Union general who commanded one of the divisions on that perimeter said if the attack, the Confederate attack, had happened at 6 a.m., it wouldn't have lasted an hour.
After the war, a bitter Bragg will write, "If not for that 3-hour delay, our independence might have been won." The previous day at Chickamauga had been as savage as any battle in more than 2 years of civil war. The invading Union Army of the Cumberland, led by General William Rosecrans, is determined to gain control of the critical rail center of Chattanooga, Tennessee. Chattanooga is a gateway to the Deep South, the heartland where factories, farmlands, and railroads are critical to the Confederate war effort. Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee hoped to not just stop Rosecrans, but to destroy his army of 58,000. The two armies collided just 8 miles south of Chattanooga on September 19, 1863. After the first day of fighting, the Battle of Chickamauga is a draw.
It was an unbelievably savage, knockdown, drag-out fight in the woods. I would say that it's almost like Shiloh multiplied by 2.
They're rising! They're coming over the rise!
Now, less than 3 months after the devastating Confederate loss at Gettysburg, the Army of Tennessee resumes a battle they believe can reverse the fortunes of the Confederacy. Among the first to challenge the Union defenses at Chickamauga is the Kentucky Orphan Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Benjamin Helm. When the war began, Helm was offered a position with the Union Army by his brother-in-law, a high-ranking official with the U.S. government. Helm instead chose to fight for the Confederacy. Fighting under Helm's command is 22-year-old Johnny Green.
A perfect shower of grape tore through our ranks. We fired a volley and rushed upon them.
For God's sake, the man who gets shot!
our beloved and gallant General Helm fell mortally wounded,
Come in, stranger!
leading his brigade, which he knew would never falter.
Surgeons realize Helms's wound is fatal. The Confederate general clings to life for several more hours, but dies the next morning. Since the battle began, the two forces have been slugging it out along a 4-mile front astride the Lafayette Road. The Confederate attack on September 20th targets the Union left. But what will determine the outcome of Chickamauga is a hole in the Union center. Miscommunication, confusion, and fatigue with Rosecrans and his generals have left a gap more than a 1/4 mile wide.
The one weakness for the Union High Command was Rosecrans himself. On the night of the 19th, Rosecrans had not gotten any sleep, and as a result, by the time the action began on September the 20th, the Union Army commander is on the verge of physical and mental collapse.
The approaching Confederates are commanded by none other than James Longstreet, the trusted lieutenant of Robert E. Lee. Longstreet and 11,000 soldiers from the Army of Northern Virginia had arrived just the night before.
It was the only time in the war that significant numbers of troops were pulled away from Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, transferred to the Western Theater to fight there. And it shows that this is the Confederacy's big effort to reverse the tide of the war in the West. And now Longstreet's corps, 8 brigades, rolled straight through that gap and directly into the rear of the Union Army. And for the Confederate troops, it was thrilling. General Bushrod Johnson called it a scene of unsurpassed grandeur as they realized that for the first time in the Western Theater, the Confederacy was on the verge of a magnificent victory.
The stunning breakthrough effectively splits the Union Army at Chickamauga. Rosecrans and a third of his force leave the battlefield. The Union right soon crumbles.
Break over the company, lads!
But not all the Union soldiers leave the field at Chickamauga. Troops under the command of General George Thomas quickly form a defense. On Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge, they stand firm. Ready to charge up the steep wooded slope and end the battle are nearly 3,000 Confederates. Among them is Lieutenant Joshua Callaway of the 28th Alabama. 17 months earlier, Callaway left his wife, Dulcinea, and 2 small children at their home near Selma. Almost 1/3 of all white households in the Confederacy own slaves. Callaway is among those who do not. Like so many others on both sides of the battlefield, the Callaways communicate through a series of letters.
My dear love, I have just passed through the terrible ordeal of a hard battle. Our brigade formed at the foot of a long hill, at the top of which was the enemy's line. The battle was raging all along our line, as if heaven and earth were coming together. 1,000 thunderstorms all turned loose could not equal the noise.
Dulcinea Callaway is hearing things she's never heard before. She's never read letters from a family member in war. So these letters are obviously going to make her fearful and very concerned about her husband's well-being. How this war was going to turn out was a big unknown. And that was a source of daily fear for a mother like Dulcinea Calloway.
The carnage was awful. Men were shot down all around me. I was indeed in the very midst of death.
On Snodgrass Hill, the Battle of Chickamauga reaches its culmination. The attacking Confederates taste victory, but Thomas's outnumbered defenders repulse charge after charge. Thomas's heroic defense allows the remaining Union forces to escape. For that stand, Thomas becomes known as the Rock of Chickamauga. By day's end, the last of Union troops withdraw. The carnage of the battle exceeds even the bloodbath at Shiloh. At Chickamauga, more than 34,000 from both armies are dead, wounded, or missing. The combined casualties are the second most of any battle in the war. Only Gettysburg exceeds the butchery of Chickamauga. Though victorious, the staggering number of those lost in the ranks is a serious problem plaguing the Confederacy.
The Confederates have a problem. The Confederates realize the arithmetic, and they're not winning the arithmetic. If they expend more men, even equal to the loss in the Union armies, they will eventually cease to have the ability to put men in the field.
Joshua Calloway somehow makes it through the battle unscathed.
We now moved to the top of the hill and slept on the battlefield. Napoleon's sign of victory. I have now seen and experienced the horrors of war, as well as the spoils and glories. I am very well, thank God. 1,000 kisses for you and the children. Your loving, J.K. Calloway.
"600 miles to the north in Washington, D.C., President Abraham Lincoln receives a telegram of the Union debacle. With the report comes devastating news about an enemy officer. Killed at Chickamauga is his brother-in-law, Benjamin Hardin Helm. Lincoln's trusted friend is Supreme Court Justice David Davis.
I never saw Mr. Lincoln more moved than when he heard of the death of his young brother-in-law. Davis, he said, I feel
like
as
David of old when he heard of the death of Absalom.
I saw how grief-stricken he was, so I closed the door and left him.
Lincoln's grief reflects the state of a nation that is beginning to crack under the pressure of a civil war. 2 months earlier, in July of 1863, laborers in New York City reacted with violence to a law establishing the nation's first military draft. Many of the protesters are impoverished immigrants from Ireland. They're particularly enraged over a provision of the law that allows draftees the option to buy their way out of service for $300. Angry mobs roam Manhattan, killing policemen and setting the city ablaze. But the protesters' venom is particularly aimed at New York's 12,000 African Americans. An orphanage for black children is torched. The 233 children inside escape before the building burns to the ground.
Ultimately, Northerners who descended against this conflict, they felt aggrieved, misled, abandoned by a president who had turned a war for Union into a war for Union and emancipation.
It wasn't until the arrival of Union soldiers who just fought at Gettysburg that 5 days of rioting was finally quelled. Hundreds were killed. Some 2,000 were injured. 11 black citizens were dragged from their homes and lynched by the angry mob.
Once they thought that Northern boys were going to die for the freedom of African Americans, that was simply more than what they could stomach. That class of individuals was seen as responsible for bringing this war on and for ultimately taking Northern boys from their homes, sending them to the front lines where they were dying in droves.
By September 1863, Northern casualties have eclipsed 400,000. At the Battle of Chickamauga alone are 16,000 Union casualties. Chickamauga is undeniably a Confederate victory, but a hollow one. Bragg has allowed Rosecrans and his Union Army to escape to Chattanooga.
Bragg getting lucky at Chickamauga, winning the field. They win a tactical victory, no doubt about it. But he doesn't have Chattanooga. Confederates failed to exercise any strategic potential from that victory.
Bragg moves his army from the Chickamauga battlefield to the heights overlooking Union-occupied Chattanooga. There, he plans to lay siege to the city. Lincoln and his cabinet fear it could become Vicksburg in reverse. As summer turns to autumn, the situation for the Union forces at Chattanooga grows desperate. Bragg has, in essence, cut off all supply lines into the city. The trapped and now starving Army of the Cumberland is not just defeated, it's demoralized. The Army's ineffective commander, William Stark Rosecrans, is described by Lincoln as stunned like a duck hit in the head. On October 21st, Rosecrans is replaced, and the most familiar face in the Western theater assumes overall command.
Who arrives on the scene, I think, is arguably one of the greatest soldiers the Civil War ever produced, and that's Ulysses S. Grant. What Grant had was nothing you could teach. Grant had a natural ability.
Within days of Grant's arrival, supplies and reinforcements begin to slip into Chattanooga through a supply route called the Cracker Line.
And Grant comes right in and immediately opens up the supply flow and then begins, as Grant is always thinking, how can I take the fight to the enemy?
Now it's Grant's enemy that has become demoralized. By November 1863, even the weather seems to be turning against Bragg and his men. For the men in the Confederate trenches, the Civil War is not just about states' rights or the institution of slavery. In the war's third year, it's also about defending your home and your family. In the gloom of late autumn, Bragg's men begin to realize that the victory at Chickamauga has been wasted, and the opportunity to turn the tide of the Western campaign squandered. Even more disturbing is this sobering reality. The struggle for Chattanooga will mean yet another battle. A reinforced Grant is ready to go on the offensive against the Confederates encircling Chattanooga. Most are dug in along the crest of Missionary Ridge, a 7-mile-long spine of soil and stone extending from just east of Chattanooga to the Georgia state line. For Grant, the key to victory depends on destroying the Confederate stronghold.
His plan was to cross the Tennessee River northeast of Chattanooga and get on the flank of Missionary Ridge and then advance along Missionary Ridge, rolling up the Confederate line.
November 19th, 1863. On the very day Lincoln gives the Gettysburg Address, Joshua Calloway climbs Lookout Mountain. The 2,300-foot precipice towers over the Union forces in Chattanooga.
Dear Lolly, yesterday I got some fellows to go up to the top of Lookout Mountain. I could not help but feel a spark of ambition and desire to make my name as immortal as that of Lookout Mountain. My ambition cooled off, and I began to think how I'd be perfectly content to be at home with my wife, never thought of after I die. You need not be at all surprised to hear of some demonstration at any moment. As ever, your devoted, J.K. Calloway.
November 24th, 1863. On a foggy, misty day, Grant's trusted lieutenant, William Tecumseh Sherman, leads a Union force of 16,000 from Chattanooga to the northern tip of Missionary Ridge. The assault on the Confederate stronghold is about to begin. The same day, General Joseph Hooker and some 10,000 Union troops attack 1,500 Confederates dug into Lookout Mountain. The all-day fight becomes known as the Battle Above the Clouds. By nightfall, the overwhelmed Confederates evacuate. But the fate of Chattanooga will not be determined at Lookout Mountain, but rather Missionary Ridge. The next morning, Sherman's assault on Missionary Ridge goes nowhere. Atop the heights are 4,000 Confederates, skillfully led by General Patrick Cleburne. A Confederate defender remarks, "We feel we can kill all they send after us." With Sherman's attack paralyzed, Grant turns to George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga. Grant orders Thomas to attack Confederate rifle pits at the base of Missionary Ridge. But Thomas's veterans do not stop there. They continue up the steep slope with one thing in mind: redemption.
Once Thomas's troops took the trenches at the base of the ridge, what the hell were they supposed to do? They now were exposed to Confederate fire up the ridge. They just started moving up the defiles. It's not much different than the guys going ashore at Omaha Beach. They know they got to take the high ground eventually.
The Union attack on Missionary Ridge is one of the most dramatic moments of the entire war.
Among the Confederate defenders of Missionary Ridge, the scene was pandemonium and confusion. With that, there was nothing left for the Confederates to do but get away as quick as they could, and they fled down the back slope of Missionary Ridge as fast as they could run.
Colonel C. Irvine Walker of the 10th South Carolina Infantry.
I don't think any feat of the war can equal their attack on Missionary Ridge. If only our men had held their ground, it would have been child's play. But instead, they fled panic-stricken before the enemy. When I saw the men running, I could not believe that these were the heroes of Shiloh, Perryville, Oak Hills, and Chickamauga.
Bragg orders a retreat into Georgia. With the Confederate defeat at Chattanooga, the gateway to the deep South has been pried open. A junior officer from Bragg's army later calls the defeat at Missionary Ridge the death knell of the Confederacy. The battles of Chickamauga and Chattanooga result in 30,000 casualties for the Army of Tennessee. Some 2,500 give their lives to the Confederate cause. Two weeks after the battles for Chattanooga, Dulcinea Calloway receives another correspondence.
Mrs. J.K. Calloway, it now falls to my unhappy lot to write you a short letter letting you know what has become of your much-beloved husband, Lieutenant Joshua K. Calloway, who fell in the Battle of Missionary Ridge, mortally wounded. While rallying his company, he was shot through the bowels with a minie-ball. We picked him up and started off the field when he asked us to lay him down and die. I have every reason to believe he's gone to a better land, where there's no more war. The company and officers deeply sympathize with you in his loss. But what is your loss and our loss is his eternal gain. W.F. Aycock, Lieutenant Company K, 28th Alabama Regiment.
With the death of her husband and the knowledge now that he's not coming home, Dulcinea Calloway has to begin envisioning a future that she is going to create for her children on her own. And she's just like so many other white women in the South, because 18% of Southern white men of military age died in this war. That's a significant loss, and it left many widows behind. And these widows, though, what choice do they have? They have to move on.
By the end of 1863, the war in the East remains a stalemate. But the Western theater is, thus far, a stunning success for Union forces. Since the war began, the North has been victorious at Forts Henry and Donelson, Shiloh, Corinth, Stones River, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga. For the South, the Union Navy has captured the major port of New Orleans and now controls the entire Mississippi River. Equally important is the naval blockade along the Gulf Coast that is squeezing the life out of the Confederate economy.
And now the armies are poised on the border of Georgia, and you can push down into not just Georgia, but Alabama. And you can really strike that final dagger into the heart of the Western Confederacy.
That dagger is now in the hands of Union General William Tecumseh Sherman. That's because Lincoln has promoted Ulysses S. Grant to Lieutenant General, making him General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant chooses to make his field headquarters with the Army of the Potomac in its fight in Virginia.
And so what Lincoln is hoping
based on his horrible experience with generals in the East, that if he can bring Grant from the West to the East, Grant is going to do in the East what he did in the West. Grant understands what Lincoln's understood for several years, that to win this war, the Union has to attack the Confederacy simultaneously everywhere.
In Virginia, Grant will attempt to do what no Union general has been able to accomplish: accept the unconditional surrender of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia.
People in the North might have sat back and said, well, the war is almost over now. Victory is within reach. Grant is ready to move on Richmond. Sherman is ready to move on Atlanta. We'll just start counting the weeks now until the war ends. And then it all dried up.
May 1864. A succession of battles in the confused terrain northwest of Richmond results in a bloodbath for the Union Army of the Potomac. At the battles of Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor, Grant's forces suffer a staggering 50,000 casualties. The catastrophic loss of life helps to fuel a growing anti-war movement in the North. A vocal faction of the Democratic Party, dubbed Copperheads by their Republican rivals, vehemently denounce Lincoln's war policies. One New York Copperhead writes, "The war is murder, nothing else."
If you look at how politics is being done on the ground in 1864, what's been happening? In Ohio, Clement Laird Vallandigham, an Ohio Democratic congressman who has actually been arrested for anti-war activities and expelled into the ranks of the Confederacy, is now running for governor of Ohio from his vantage point across the border in Canada. And he has thousands upon thousands of people turning out in rallies to support him. The governor of New York is now a Democrat. The governor of New Jersey is now a Democrat. All of them very public, very vehement in their denunciation of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Lincoln administration.
The Copperheads not only demand Lincoln's ouster, but also an immediate peace treaty with the Confederacy. They will become a political force in a year when Lincoln faces re-election. While Grant's offensive stalls in Virginia, Sherman begins to move his army of 100,000 from Chattanooga into Georgia. His mission? To capture Atlanta, a major manufacturing center and industrial hub of the Confederate war machine. Its 4 railroad lines bind together what is left of the Confederacy.
The purpose of ultimately taking Atlanta was to also bring havoc and destruction to the Confederacy's ability to field troops, to supply them, to keep their economy going.
Rail lines run through Atlanta. Munitions are being produced in Atlanta. Clothing is being produced in Atlanta. You have to strike that last, not just vulnerable place, you have to strike that last important place.
Marching towards Atlanta with the 111th Illinois Infantry is Austin Gilmore, a former slave from Tennessee who has volunteered to fight. Austin, however, will not serve as a soldier, but rather as a cook. Like many in the North, Sherman does not trust the fighting abilities of the African Americans. After the war, he writes, the Negro should be a free man, but not put on any equality with whites. But hundreds of miles west, at places like Port Gibson, Mississippi, and Milliken's Bend, Louisiana, African Americans have already proven Sherman wrong.
Let my people go.
In June 1863, along the Mississippi River at Milliken's Bend. Black soldiers put up fierce resistance to a Confederate attack.
At Milliken's Bend, you have untrained soldiers from Mississippi who do not really know how to fire their weapons. They end up in hand-to-hand combat. They started using their bayonets and using their muskets as clubs. And once you hear the stories of those who served in combat, how they fought, then you realize they really are making a statement. They're making it with their blood.
Assistant Secretary of War Charles A. Dana writes of the Battle of Milliken Bend. The bravery of the blacks completely revolutionized the sentiment of the Army with regard to the employment of Negro troops. But with their service has also come tragedy and controversy. As Sherman prepares for the Atlanta campaign, a detachment of Confederate cavalry attacks Fort Pillow, a Union post along the Mississippi River. It is 40 miles north of Memphis. The cavalry is under command of Nathan Bedford Forrest. To this day, Forrest is at once reviled and revered. Before the war, he made a fortune in the slave trade. Enlisting as a private, Forrest's daring battlefield exploits has seen him rise to the rank of Major General. Among the 500-plus defenders of Fort Pillow are 262 men of the U.S. Colored Artillery. As they attempt to surrender, many of the soldiers are killed. Confederate Sergeant Achilles V. Clark wrote, "The poor deluded Negroes would run up to our men, fall upon their knees, and with uplifted hands scream for mercy. But they were ordered to their feet and shot down. 200 of the 262 black soldiers at Fort Pillow are killed." A federal investigation after the war concludes most were shot after the Union garrison had surrendered. The slaughter at Fort Pillow enrages people throughout the North. In the South, the Congress of the Confederate States adopts a resolution expressing its appreciation for Forrest. With thousands of African Americans now fighting for the Union, Confederate President Jefferson Davis makes it clear that captured black soldiers will not be treated as prisoners of war, but rather as slaves, to be returned to bondage. Which makes the story of Emma Stevenson all the more remarkable. Like Austin Gilmore, Emma is emancipated. Now, marching towards Atlanta with Sherman's army, Emma is a nurse with the 17th Army Corps.
I think a part of performing that kind of work is that you want to have a stake in liberating your people and in essentially liberating yourself. That's a powerful message. And so it's very important for Americans to know that there were Emma Stevensons in the midst of the war.
In Sherman's Way, 30 miles south of Chattanooga, is a Confederate army of 65,000 men. Braxton Bragg has been replaced with General Joseph Johnston. Johnston knows that the very future of the Confederacy depends on protecting Atlanta.
Keep it moving.
At every opportunity, Johnston's men build miles of makeshift fortifications. For the Confederates, outnumbered almost 2-1, trench warfare is an effective defensive strategy. One good man behind earthworks, writes an officer, should prevail over 4 or 5 opponents advancing in the open without cover. The Federals respond with trenches of their own.
Keep your head down, gentlemen.
Often the opposing earthworks lie within a few yards of each other.
Keep your head down, Jackson. There he is. Got him.
Sergeant Johnny Green is a Confederate with the 9th Kentucky Infantry.
Anyone who shows his head above the trenches is sure to have 2 or 3 Minnie-Balls come singing around his ears. But we soon got so accustomed to it that the boys grew very careless.
Keep your heads down, gentlemen. Keep your heads down, man. Hit your target, but keep your heads down.
For the past month in northern Georgia, Sherman and Johnston have been waging a deadly game of chess. Time and again, Sherman has tried to outflank the Confederate army. Each time, his moves have been checked by Johnston. But in the process, the Confederate general has been forced to yield precious ground. By mid-June 1864, Johnston's army is backed up to within 20 miles of Atlanta. Caught in a crossfire in the campaign for Atlanta are the people of Cobb County, Georgia. Population 14,000. About 1/3 of those are slaves. Most of the residents are not wealthy plantation owners, but yeoman farmers who do not own slaves.
Hurry, girls, hurry!
Lucinda Casey is a widow.
That's it, let's go!
She struggles to keep the family farm while raising 3 children.
Louisa, get her. Louisa, will you help her, please? Come on, Nancy.
As Sherman's army approaches, Lucinda and daughters Louisa, Nancy, and Hazeltine quickly pack their belongings and flee to the safety of Atlanta. In June 1864, more than 100,000 soldiers from both Confederate and Union armies ravage Cobb County. At Lucinda Casey's home, nothing is spared.
As Sherman's troops made their way through Georgia, it showed that this war had changed. It had clearly become closer to the lives of civilians. No longer was the war something fought at a distance, something that was on some remote battlefield. That kind of distance between home front and battlefield had collapsed. That really there wasn't much of a distinction anymore. And the war was now literally on people's doorsteps.
Sherman has begun to craft this new style of warfare. One of the ways that you dominate, one of the ways that you completely control, is that everything has a military objective. Everything. Every gin, every barn, every horse, every cow, and every civilian. Everything becomes a military objective.
By mid-June, Sherman's army has moved within striking distance of his objective. Only one last mountain remains between Sherman and Atlanta. Kennesaw Mountain is over 1,800 feet high and 2 miles long. Some call it the Gibraltar of Georgia. For Johnston, Kennesaw's rocky ridges are the ideal place to halt Sherman. The summit is a 700-foot precipice called Big Kennesaw. To the south is a spur named Pigeon Hill. Further south is a ridge soon to be known as Cheatham Hill. With an imposing 7-mile line of defense, the Confederates will dare Sherman to attack. Just 20 miles beyond Kennesaw Mountain is Atlanta.
So by the time that you get to Kennesaw, Sherman doesn't want to flank around to the west anymore. It's getting too far from this rail line. And flanking from the east, for whatever reason, didn't seem to be much of a discussed option. And so his third option was to attack.
In the pre-dawn hours of June 27th, Union officers receive Special Field Orders Number 28.
Major General Thomas will assault the enemy at any point near his center, to be selected by himself. Major General
At Kennesaw Mountain, Sherman decides on a new tactic. Instead of flanking, he orders a frontal assault.
but attack some one point of the enemy's line is near the
Upon hearing the order, an officer with the 86th Illinois responds by saying, "The stupidity of this order is enough to paralyze me."
by order of Major General W.T. Sherman.
A little after 8 a.m., the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain begins. 5,500 Federals surge up the steep slopes of Pigeon Hill, a knob just below Kennesaw Mountain. The attack is doomed from the start.
The Battle of Kennesaw Mountain goes against everything that Sherman has been talking about and has been trying to do. Why does he do? Why does he make this, assault, direct assault against dug-in troops on a high mountain? But why does he do this when it's clear that this is just not going to work?
Sherman orders all cooks and musicians to the Kennesaw battlefield to aid the wounded. Unarmed, Austin Gilmore attempts to save a Union soldier wounded on Pigeon Hill. The former slave is struck in the hip by a mini-ball. Yet Gilmore manages to drag the soldier to safety. The Union wounded are taken to a field hospital at the base of Kennesaw Mountain. It is a crude, open-air facility with little regard to sanitation. Antibiotics have not yet been discovered. Medical instruments go unsterilized. The overwhelmed surgeons work courageously, as do battlefield nurses like Emma Stevenson.
She was in a hospital where there was probably not enough room for all of the patients there. So it was crowded, it was loud, it was horrifying. And yet she still chose this line of work. It says something about her determination to become free, her determination to do what she could to ensure that the Union Army had the labor and the resources it needed to win this war.
Sherman's frontal assault on Pigeon Hill is a disaster.
Keep putting it into him! Come on, lads, put it in!
An officer with the 53rd Ohio sums up the fight on Pigeon Hill by saying, "The rebels fought with a desperation worthy of a better cause." Simultaneous to the fight on Pigeon Hill, Sherman launches the other wave of his main attack. It occurs not at Big Kennesaw, but 2 miles south at Cheatham Hill. In the woods below Cheatham Hill are 8,000 Union soldiers. To embolden his 52nd Ohio, Colonel Dan McCook recites a poem about warriors of ancient Rome.
Outspake brave Horatius, the captain of the gate, to every man upon this earth, death cometh soon or late. And how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of your fathers and the temples of your gods?
Easy, boys, easy.
To reach the Confederate earthworks on Cheatham Hill,
Forward! March!
the Federals must advance across an open field
In battery! Heave!
and up a steep incline.
Come on, man!
It is a 400-yard march into certain death.
Come on, close up, lads, to the work!